Now, a government's budget is something few people get excited about, but as Derek Mackay puts the final touches to his plans for the next year, speculation is growing, slowly, about what he might say on Thursday. This is the first time the Scottish Government will set out how it will use new income tax powers, which were devolved earlier in the year. Charlotte Barbour is Director of Tax at ICAS and is in our Edinburgh studio, and Professor Murray Pittock is from Glasgow University. Murray Pittock, give us something to get excited about, because we already know, don't we? They've made quite clear they're not going to change income tax rates.
No, well, I mean, I may return to that. That's income tax is a trap tax because it's almost impossible to increase it. But they have got some things to play with, apart from the very much heralded changes to air passenger duty. They'll have about £1 billion to play with potentially from the restriction on the higher rate tax threshold, which they're putting down to cost of living rather than putting a corrective in place for its historic limitation, which is happening down south.
Except that's not extra money, is it? It simply means they don't lose money.
No, it is. It's extra money compared to what the tax take would be if the tax take was on a UK-wide basis. So effectively, it's potentially extra money. I mean, the issue is, and this is again a problem for the way the taxes are going to be collected in the longer term. If the Scottish growth rate continues to trail the UK growth rate, never mind the retention of the Barnett formula, there will be more and more tax on a lower and lower base. There will be quite a big slug of tax hitting the higher rate earners because, of course, the 3 council tax bands at the top are due to be raised as well. So that will have quite a significant effect.
Charlotte Barbour, I'm still curious about this extra money thing. I mean, I would have assumed that should they not implement a change in the thresholds that is being implemented in England, it doesn't give them any extra money. It just means they don't have to find the money to cover cutting people's taxes.
I think one of the things that's really interesting for me as a tax practitioner is the difference in presentation between how things operate and how you might see them from a more political perspective. There's 2 ways of seeing this. You can either compare where we sit vis-à-vis England, the rest of the UK, and if their thresholds go up, they'll have more tax relief, they'll pay less tax, and if our thresholds don't go up, correspondingly we'll pay more. On the other hand, we're not actually paying more than we're going to pay now, we're just not paying less.
Very clear, thank you for that. OK, well, given that clarity, let me ask you something else. In England and the rest of the UK, are these thresholds going to be indexed as well as increased to 50,000? So, or are they just going to go with a programme of increasing the higher rate threshold to 50,000? Because if it's just going to go to 50,000, it would mean that the higher inflation is, the less difference there would be between Scotland and England. Or is that wrong?
Why don't we take a step back for a moment? I think the whole point about the devolution of income tax rates and bands is to allow Scottish Parliament and the rest of the UK to go in different directions, and perhaps one maybe wants to question why the starting point should always be a comparison with the rest of the UK. If you go back to the Smith Commission in his report, the income tax powers offer shared powers across income tax, because that's the other thing you have to bear in mind, is that the income tax is not completely and totally devolved, that the income from it is, but not the actual underlying tax. If you look at the tax itself, then things like what is income still sits with UK legislation.
Yeah.
And in Scotland, we are going to be able to raise rates and bands on earnings, pensions, rental income, those kind of earnings. But for savings and dividends, that will stay with the UK, so will personal allowances. There's not actually a huge amount of room for manoeuvre around there.
Right, but what about my point about inflation? Is that wrong?
Inflation, the rates may be in inflation indexed, or you might raise them beyond that. What's happening in the rest of the UK is that the rates are going beyond inflation.
But on the other hand, they're not actually being indexed. I mean, that 50k is a commitment by the end of this Parliament now for Theresa May's income administration. But it's 50k nominal, it's not 50k indexed.
It's not indexed.
No.
No. So my point is, if we're going to index the threshold in Scotland, then the higher inflation goes, the nearer you come to the English rate. That was my point.
Well, you might, but it's going to take quite a bit of time, because the jumps are quite significant in the rest of the UK bands. And I think the issue is of talking about tax and divergence and why do you always compare with England is actually it's so difficult to do anything with income tax. no UK government has increased basic rate income tax since the 1974-79 Labour government. It's a toxic tax to increase. The SNP tried penny for Scotland in 1999. It was a disaster. The Labour Party are keen on an extra penny. It's not exactly been a success for them. And the Liberal Democrats want one too. But the fact is that although in the Scottish Social Attitude Survey people will say we want a far more egalitarian society in Scotland, there's a big gap between that and what they say in the rest of the UK. That's a kind of, that's a kind of warm identity expression. If you actually say to people we're going to increase the basic rate of income tax, you're an electoral loser. That's what all the evidence shows.
We won't put our money where our mouth is to sum that up.
I think that you could sum it up that way. There are also a number of issues about elsewhere in the budget which relate back to the discussion you're having earlier about targets. And the sense, in the future of Scotland getting a significant proportion of the VAT receipts, how the VAT receipts raised in Scotland, how will that be impacted by, for example, increasing council tax bands and effectively increasing the top rate of tax? Will that depress, will Scotland's lagging growth depress the VAT take? So, I mean, there are
Okay.
Do they know the measures for this? Do we know what the measures are?
Look, we're running out of time. Charlotte Barbour, something else, it may be irrelevant, but are there new borrowing powers for the Scottish Government this time? And what are they going to do with them?
There are new borrowing powers, and part of the feature of borrowing powers is to help manage the tax side of things, because obviously once you devolve tax powers, the take from the tax, it becomes less certain, not just in the kind of total amount you take, but also in fluctuations and when it comes in. So they may need to ease borrowing across that.
In other words, they need to put the money away for a rainy day in case the tax take turns out to be less than they expect.
You can either have it across that or more specifically just month by month as PAYE comes in.
Right. So they can't just max out borrowing and start building new roads and airports and stuff?
I wouldn't like to pass comment on that.
Well, you would, wouldn't you?
Well, I certainly would. I mean, it's the Corbynite policy down south, but the question is it sustainable? One thing I think they need to do, and this is a question. There are two questions here. Do they want to hypothecate the restriction on the higher rate of tax to help education and health? Another thing is, in order to prevent political criticism of lowering revenue in Scotland, do they want to quantify the impact of airport passenger duty change? I think a lot more things have to be, a lot more of the impact has to be measured and has to be quantified, because there's a real risk here of a medium-term downturn in the Scottish tax take.
Right. Just to explain to people, hypothecating taxes, that means raising a specific tax and telling people it's to pay for a specific thing.
purpose, absolutely.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both very much.